And recently, we had a man go out on a rampage with a hammer in Calgary, and he caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage to the Calgary Peace Bridge. Then last week, another guy broke into Calgary City Hall and did extensive damage to the building as he lit fires. He couldn't be immediately restrained because he was carrying a large knife, and he got injured when police arrested him. And the City Hall is still closed now due to the water and fire damage. In Montreal, last Tuesday and Wednesday, even worse, 3 people were shot and killed in what appeared to be random killings. A suspect was located on Thursday, yesterday, in a motel, and he was shot and killed by police as they tried to apprehend him. Now, the common denominator in all 3 of these incidents is that all 3 of the perpetrators were known by authorities to have serious mental disorders, but they'd been released into the public anyway. With the tragic incident in Montreal, the killer had been released from a mental institution last March, despite the psychiatrist at the hearing saying he presented a significant risk to public safety due to his mental state. They knew he was dangerous. So if an expert felt this man was dangerous, why was he released? Well, it's because of a policy trend, essentially, over decades called deinstitutionalization. Yeah, that's a big mouthful, that one. And that movement came to a head at the end of the 20th century. The rationale was that it was inhumane to keep people incarcerated for mental health disorders, and that with proper community supports and medication, they could be safely and productively living freely within the public. And in most cases, actually, this is true. In many cases, though, it's wrong, and the price of failed community integration can be pretty high, as we've seen. The push to keep people out of long-term mental health facilities is understandable. Nobody likes to think of incarcerating somebody for a disease which is no fault of their own. Just because a person can't be faulted for their mental illness, no, doesn't mean they don't present a hazard sometimes to themselves or the others around them if they aren't under control. I mean, mental institutions used to be horrible places where patients were warehoused under terrible conditions. They were often abused, and they were subject to experiments even. In the 20th century, that did change, though, and in the developed world, institutions were reformed to become more treatment-oriented and with efforts to improve the standard of living for patients. When the deinstitutionalization movement took hold, though, and I blame kind of the one flew over the cuckoo's nest. It really started in the 70s and so on, people having this thought of how terrible it is to be in a mental institution. The goal of reformation of the institutions, though, changed. It went to one of elimination. And that movement was successful in that the populations of institutions have dropped and many have even closed. In the long term, though, it's becoming evident that the movement's been a failure. Many people found themselves on the streets that really don't belong there. We have a terrible homelessness and opioid addiction epidemic, and it's killing thousands right now. The solution to that crisis is going to be complicated and multifaceted. One important facet of that puzzle, though, is the number of homeless and addicted people with serious mental health disorders that never should have been on the street in the first place. In a proper institution, medication can be supervised and regulated for patients. In a street setting, many people with serious mental disorders are self-medicating with products they get from predatory street dealers, and this compounds the person's problems as they now have an untreated mental illness and an addiction to feed. Let's quit pretending the homeless person shambling around, pushing a shopping cart while talking to themselves just needs a new apartment or a job. We won't hesitate to put a person who's physically injured in the hospital. We got to stop being so squeamish about putting people with mental and health disorders into proper care facilities as well. And yes, the difference is the person with the mental illness might lose personal choice, and I'm talking about secured facilities, but we don't have to like the necessity to accept it. Harm mitigation, it's a popular concept these days when it comes to addictions. Well, that term should be applied to people with mental health disorders as well. And the means of mitigation will be institutionalization for a lot of them. Existing mental health facilities are already overwhelmed. Conventional hospitals have mental health wings, but they're full and they don't provide good or comfortable long-term care. They're meant to be transitional, and patients are often discharged, not because they're healthy again, but because the space and resources are needed. Many people with mental health challenges have been housed in senior citizen care facilities as well, because the units housing residents with dementia are secured and there's nowhere else to put people. This is unfair to the seniors, the staff, and of course the people with the mental health illnesses. And finally, many of those with serious mental health issues end up in our prison system. They're often abused there and they don't get the treatment they need. Let's accept that a number of people with mental illnesses just can't be treated, at least not at this time, and must be secured within an institution indefinitely. The facility doesn't need to be a place of punishment or harsh living. Facilities should be well-funded and comfortable as possible while allowing visits with loved ones and as much supervised public interaction as safely possible. I'm sure many families who have lost members to the streets because of mental illness challenges would have preferred it if the family member had been secured in a facility rather than exposed to the elements and lost on the streets. If patients truly can be stabilized and eased into society, that's the best outcome. It has to be accepted, though, that many can't or won't stick to their medication, or they're untreatable, and they're going to have to remain secured. Deinstitutionalization, it's a big one. It's a well-meaning but naive and failed policy. It's time to tackle the issue of serious mental illness with a mixture of harsh realism and compassion, And that means expanding the capacity of our long-term secured mental health facilities and accepting they'll always be needed for the sake of patients and society as a whole. That's what I wanted to talk about today when we're seeing so many of these terrible outcomes lately.